Good evening. Tonight's story is about a desert, and about water hidden in it on purpose. It takes place in what is now southern Jordan, mostly around 2,000 years ago. You do not need to keep track of anything. There will be a few names and a few dates, and you may let all of them go. If you drift off partway, that is exactly right, and the story will carry on without you. Settle in. Let your jaw unclench. We will go slowly, and we will stay slow the whole way. Start with the country itself. South of the Dead Sea, the land rises into a broken plateau of sandstone and limestone, cut through by dry valleys. In Arabic, those valleys are called wadis. For most of the year, a wadi is simply a stony floor you can walk along. Then, a few times each winter, rain falls somewhere up on the high ground, and the wadi becomes a river for a few hours, and then it is a stony floor again. Almost all the water arrives in those few hours. There is very little rainfall here in most years, well under 200 millimeters, and in some years almost none. To live in such a place permanently, you must either be very close to a spring, or you must catch the winter and keep it. The people we are following did both. They were called the Nabataeans, and they spoke a form of Arabic while writing in a version of the Aramaic script, a script which, incidentally, is one of the ancestors of the Arabic writing used today. They come into the historical record around the 4th century before the Common Era, already established in this region, already trading. Where exactly they came from before that is not known with any confidence. There are theories. None is settled. It is one of a number of things about them we simply do not have. Our earliest real description of them comes from a Greek writer, Diodorus Siculus, drawing on an older account by a man who had dealings with them around 312 before the Common Era. He describes a people who were then still moving with their herds, and he records something that has stayed with everyone who reads it. It was their law, he says, not to sow grain, not to plant fruit trees, not to drink wine, and not to build houses. Anyone who did so faced punishment. The reason given is entirely practical. A people with fields and houses can be forced to submit, because the fields and the houses can be threatened. A people with none of these things can simply withdraw into the desert, where a heavier army cannot follow. Their freedom was built on owning nothing that could be taken. He then describes their water strategy, and it is remarkable. They dug cisterns in the ground in secret places out in the waterless country, lined them so they would not leak, and covered the openings, leaving marks that only they could read. When pursued, they went to water their enemies could not find. Now hold that idea for a moment, because in a few centuries these same people will be living in a stone city with theaters and temples and imported wine. Circumstances change. Laws made for one situation get quietly set aside in another. The reason for that change is trade. Far to the south, in the corner of Arabia around what is now Yemen and Oman, two particular trees grow. One yields frankincense, the other myrrh, both aromatic resins, both obtained by cutting the bark and letting the sap harden into pale lumps. In the ancient Mediterranean world, these were burned in enormous quantities at temples and at funerals, and used in medicine and perfume. Demand was constant and the supply came from one distant place. Between the source and the buyers lay around 2,000 kilometers of desert. Somebody had to move the goods across it. The Nabataeans were positioned exactly where the northern end of that road had to pass, and they knew the water. That combination made them indispensable, and then it made them rich. Camel caravans came north in stages, each stage ending at a place where animals could drink. The Nabataeans controlled many of those places. They charged for passage, they provided guides and protection, and in time they were doing much of the carrying themselves. The scale is worth pausing on. Ancient sources talk of caravans of hundreds of camels, and Rome's appetite for incense was enormous. One Roman writer complains bitterly about the sums leaving the empire eastwards every year for goods that were, in the end, set on fire. With that wealth, they built. Their principal city sits in a bowl among the mountains, reached most famously through a narrow winding gorge over a kilometer long, where the rock walls rise steeply on both sides and the daylight comes down in a strip. It is called the Seek. At the far end, the walls part, and directly ahead stands a facade cut into the cliff, columns, pediment, a round tholos at the top about 40 meters high, all of it carved out of the living rock rather than built up out of blocks. Nothing was assembled. Stone was removed until the building was there. Masons worked downwards from the top, cutting the upper details first and taking the scaffolding of rock away as they descended, because there was no other safe way to do it. The stone here is sandstone, and it holds bands of iron and manganese, so its color shifts through pinks and reds and pale golds as the light moves. Early European visitors called it the Rose-Red City, and the phrase stuck, from a poem written by a man who had never been there. The city's name, Petra, is simply the Greek word for rock. It is worth being careful here about what those great carved facades are. Most of them are tombs. Behind the elaborate fronts are chambers cut into the hillside, and the elaboration is on the outside, where it could be seen. The famous one at the end of the gorge was named the Treasury much later by local people, from a story that a pharaoh's gold was hidden in the stone urn near its top. The urn is solid rock. There is no gold in it. The building's original purpose is not certain, though a royal tomb is the usual view. That uncertainty is typical. The Nabataeans left inscriptions, mostly short, mostly dedications and grave notices, but no histories of their own that survive. Almost everything narrative we have about them was written by Greeks and Romans, from outside. So we know their kings' names, we know a great deal about their pottery, and we know very little about what they believed in any detail, or what they said to each other. The people who lived in Petra did not live in the tombs. They lived in ordinary houses in the valley floor, most of which have not survived nearly as well as the rock-cut monuments, because ordinary houses seldom do. And here is the thing that I find genuinely astonishing, and that most visitors walk straight past. The whole city is a piece of water engineering, and the engineering is largely invisible. Look at the walls of the gorge as you go through and you will see a channel cut along one side at about chest height, and traces of another opposite. Those carried water into the city from a spring several kilometers away, along a gradient so slight it had to be surveyed with real precision. In places the channel becomes a pipeline of interlocking ceramic sections. The internal diameter of those pipes appears to have been chosen deliberately narrow enough to keep the flow smooth and full, so that the water did not begin to churn and lose energy on its way down the slope. There were also settling basins where sediment could drop out, and dozens of cisterns cut into the rock, plastered inside, and closed at the top so that evaporation was limited and the water stayed clean. Estimates suggest the system could supply tens of thousands of people. In a valley receiving perhaps 150 millimeters of rain a year, they had reliable water, and gardens, and at least one pool with a pavilion in the middle of it. The luxury visitors admire rests entirely on the plumbing they do not see. The same skill was turned to the opposite problem. A city built in the bottom of a bowl, entered through a narrow gorge, has an obvious weakness. A heavy storm on the high ground sends a great deal of water down that gorge very quickly. The Nabataeans dealt with this by building a dam across the entrance to the Seek and cutting a tunnel through the rock beside it, so that floodwater was diverted into a neighboring wadi and sent away from the city entirely. The dam has been reconstructed in modern times, on the ancient foundations, and it does the same job. That is the pattern of everything they built. Take the water you want, and send the rest somewhere else, and do both by reading the shape of the ground very carefully. They farmed the same way in the countryside around, with low walls across slopes to slow the runoff and hold soil, and terraces to catch what fell. There is good evidence they were growing grain and grapes and olives in country that looks, to an untrained eye, entirely unfarmable, which means that old law against sowing had by then been thoroughly abandoned. Their kingdom lasted a long time as such things go. Aretas IV, who reigned for around 50 years either side of the turn of the millennium, presided over what is usually considered its height. Coins from his reign name his queen alongside him. Nabataean women appear in the inscriptions holding and disposing of property in their own right, which was not universal in the region at the time. Then, in 106 of the Common Era, the kingdom was absorbed into the Roman Empire and became the province of Arabia Petra. This seems to have happened without a war. The last king died, and the annexation followed, and the archaeological record shows continuity rather than destruction. Building carried on, the Romans put a colonnaded street through the center, and life went on under a new administration. What changed the city's fortunes was not politics but routes. Sea trade through the Red Sea became cheaper and more reliable than the long overland haul, and the caravans thinned. Later, the center of regional importance shifted north to Palmyra and Bosra. A serious earthquake in 363 damaged much of Petra, and further earthquakes followed. The population drifted away over centuries. Not driven out. Simply, gradually, elsewhere. The city was never lost. Exactly, the Bedouin of the region always knew perfectly well where it was, and lived among the tombs. But it dropped out of European awareness for a very long time, until 1812, when a Swiss traveler called Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, traveling under an assumed name and considerable difficulty, persuaded a guide to take him to the ruins on the pretext of making a sacrifice at a nearby shrine. He was allowed only a short look, and had to record what he saw without appearing too interested. His notes brought Petra back into European view, and the visitors, and eventually the poem with the phrase about the rose-red city. Excavation has continued ever since, and it is nowhere near finished. As recently as 2016, researchers using satellite imagery and drones identified a very large platform structure under the sand, close to the city center, that nobody had recognized, the size of a swimming pool complex, sitting in plain sight, unnoticed. It is a reminder that even a place photographed 1 million times can still be holding things back. So what do we have, in the end? A people who began by refusing to build anything, because anything built could be taken from them. Who made their living on the empty spaces between places, and on knowing what those spaces contained. Who eventually did build extravagantly, into cliffs, but who built the important part underground, where you cannot admire it. The tombs get the photographs. The pipes did the work. There is a nice symmetry in it. Diodorus tells us they hid their cisterns in the desert and marked them so that only they could find them. Centuries later, in their capital, they were still doing essentially the same thing, only now the hidden water ran under a paved street past a temple. If you were to sit on a rock above the valley late in the day, you would see the light on the sandstone going from gold towards deep red, and the carved fronts standing in the cliff faces with the dark of the chambers behind them, and you would not see a single drop of the water that made all of it possible. That was rather the point. We will leave it there, with the last light on the rock and the valley going quiet. Somewhere below, a cistern cut 2,000 years ago is still holding the winter rain, capped, cool, out of the sun, waiting for a use it will not be put to. There is nothing more to do tonight. Let the words fade out however they wish. Sleep well. Sleepy history, true stories, told slowly.